So the Fujifilm GFX 50R, another really exciting Fujifilm product. They seem to be really hitting the ball out of the park with some of their cameras and lenses over the last few months, and this is no exception. Now, I tried to shoot a video that was more like a vlog, so I was out and about using the camera, telling you what it was like to actually sort of have it in hand and use it. And I'm going to show you some of that, but I'm going to mix it in with some of this kind of studio stuff just to fill in a few more of those details. So sit back and enjoy. Here's my kind of product overview, first look of the Fujifilm GFX 50R. So I'm up in the Peak District and I have with me the Fujifilm GFX 50R. Now I'm going to be using this over the next few days while I'm up here, but this isn't the usual full-on review because it's Christmas time and I just want to enjoy myself and try using a camera rather than thinking too much about testing it. So think of this more as a sort of hands-on extended first look and just my experiences actually using the GFX 50R. So if you don't know about this, we have a very large medium format-ish size sensor. Look at that. Don't want to expose it to too much dust, so lens very quickly back on. Now it's not quite medium format size. It's bigger than full frame, but it's not quite verging on sort of 645 territory, just a touch smaller. Now they've had the GFX 50S for a while now, and that has a sort of slightly more conventional style body, for want of a better word, whereas the 50R is kind of a range finder style. In terms of using it, everything buttons and dials wise is very much as you'd expect from Fuji. Everything's exactly where it would be. So one thing to note here, we have no image stabilization. There's no stabilization sensor in the camera and the lenses are optically stabilized, except I believe the 3 lenses that I've got on me actually aren't optically stabilized. So I'm going to be shooting handheld. We'll be using a monopod and tripod where I can, but really just want to go out exploring. Okay, so let's talk about the sensor in here in a little bit more detail. Now it's medium format size, but to me that conjures up kind of images of 6x6 centimeter square or 645 or 6x7, even 6x9. But the sensor in here isn't that big. It's a smaller sensor than you'd see in those high-end kind of Hasselblad and Phase 1 medium format backs. In fact, it's about 1.7 times larger than a full frame sensor, so it's not quite twice as large. Now, of course, the other difference between APS-C and full frame sensors is the fact that rather than a 3:2 ratio, the medium format sensor in the Fujifilm GFX 50R is actually a 4:3 ratio sensor. So you'll get a slightly squarer image, much like a traditional medium format camera. So the sensor doesn't have Fujifilm's X-Trans array. Presumably that's to help keep the cost of the product down. It is significantly cheaper than Hasselblad and Phase 1 medium format cameras. Got a nice view down there with loads of shadows created by these silver birch trees, and they're all completely sort of in silhouette because we've got the sun behind and a bit of mist in the background. It might be a nice sort of pattern shot there. So I'm going to swap the 45mm lens that I've got over for the 110mm lens. So this should be more like the equivalent of kind of an 85mm lens. So this is an 85 f2 lens. So let's talk about lenses. Now you have to times the focal length by 0.7 to get the 35mm equivalent. So for example, the 45mm lens, times that by 0.7 and it actually becomes the equivalent of more like a 35mm lens. So in the same vein, the 63mm lens is actually the equivalent of a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, and the 110mm lens is actually the equivalent to an 85mm lens. Now, they were the lenses that I was given and that I took out with me. Would have liked something maybe just a touch wider for doing some landscape shots, but it was a nice selection of different focal lengths to play with. And there's actually quite a few lenses now in the GFX lineup. Now, the larger sensor and the longer focal length kind of equivalents compared to full frame do mean that obviously the depth of field changes slightly. So the apertures remain the same. Obviously there's the same amount of light coming in. f2.8 is still 2.8 in terms of the light entering the lens, at least from a kind of mathematical point of view. but the depth of field does change. So for instance, this 45mm 2.8, off the top of my head, is nearer sort of, it's not quite f2, but it's nearer kind of f2.2 equivalent when it comes to the depth of field. So you're getting that shallower depth of field, medium format effect. When people talk about that medium format effect, all they're really talking about is just that shallower depth of field that you can get from the lenses and the larger sensor. There's not a lot more to it than that, really. F8 ISO 400 there, and I was able to shoot at 280th of a second with the 110mm lens, and it looks pretty sharp from here on the back of the screen. Have to have a look at a computer to see what it's like, but looks more than sharp enough for me. Let's go and see what other shots we can find. I just stood up from taking that last shot, and just behind me there's just the cloud and the mist and the sort of the fog in the valley down there. The light's hitting it beautifully, and I think there's a shot. Could almost do like a 200mm here actually. The sort of 85 equivalent is nice, but it'd be nice to sort of zoom in a little bit, just more on just some of those details. So the image on the back of the screen looks all right. It's not going to change the world, but the great thing is because I've got 50 million pixels to play with from this sensor, I've got plenty of room to be able to crop into the image and get kind of the framing that I want. 110mm is a little bit too short for this, kind of 85mm equivalent. Would have preferred 105, maybe even 200mm equivalent. I'm not entirely sure there's going to be a shot here, but I like the rocks in the water, which looks sort of really dark and jet black. And then we've just got the last of the leaves just on this tree, which might just get some nice saturated colours out of. Whoa, a little bit muddy down here by the water's edge. Let's have a look. Yes, that actually looks really nice. Just got to find the right angle for it now. So making good use of the fact the GFX 50R, we've got a tilting touchscreen here. So what I've been doing is obviously tilting that down just so I can hold it up and just get a slightly different angle on my composition. And then we've got touchscreen so you can move the AF point around, which is really great for being able to hold the camera up high. And once you've got it held up to your eye, actually, you can then use your thumb just to shift the AF point around the screen. So even when you've got the camera held up to your eye, you can still use your thumb on the back to actually control the AF point and get it to where you want it. If you double tap with your thumb, it will do a 2x magnification or a magnified view so that you can actually see whether you've got it sharp in focus, which is great, obviously, if you're manually focusing with the lens. So something a bit ridiculous now, as the battery on the GFX 50R is about to die. I'm going to try vlogging with it, which is a bit ridiculous. I'm at f8, so it should give the AF in continuous mode a chance to at least try and hold me in focus. And of course I'm using those internal microphones, and yeah, probably not long before this battery dies, so apologies if it cuts out. As you can see, this morning's a bit of a washout. Not a lot in terms of light, it's a little bit dull, but it's not misty enough to take those really nice kind of misty landscapes. But I'm not bothered because I found a couple of really nice locations that I want to go back and shoot when the light is good. So by no means a wasted morning at all. And I've got to learn a little bit more about using the 50R. And hopefully, fingers crossed, next time this video cuts, the weather should be a little bit nicer. Video wise, it's not meant for video, forget it. The continuous AF is very slow, it hunts back and forth. That said, I did actually really like the look. It's got that great Fujifilm colour science going on in here, and of course you can get some very shallow depth of field. But don't expect this to be a camera that's designed for serious video in any way, shape or form. So as you can see, I'm actually back in the car. I'm not out shooting, and the reason for that is because the battery in the 50R went flat, and this is actually a few days later because Guess who's an idiot? Me, because I didn't pack the battery charger for the 50R in my bag. Not a problem, I thought to myself, I will charge via USB. After all, the 50R does have a USB-C port on the bottom there. But as I found out, that is only for data transfer, so you can't charge the camera via USB. So I went and got a universal battery charger, but that only outputs about 8 volts, as most of them do. And this requires, it's either 12 or 14, can't quite work it out, I think it's 14, to charge it. So basically couldn't charge it via the universal charger. Now that's because basically this is a big old battery and it has to power obviously the large screen and the huge sensor. So it requires a larger kick than your standard kind of camera battery. Now, obviously completely my fault. I'm the idiot who forgot the charger. So, you know, what you're gonna do. However, normally obviously USB charging would get me out of this situation, but in this case, can't do it because of this. So just something to bear in mind that you're probably going to want to get at least 2, maybe even 3 batteries if you're buying the camera. And these aren't cheap either. I think they're about the £80 mark or something like that. So yeah, you might want to set aside a little bit of money to buy one of those. Anyway, I've come to the beach. It's fairly early in the morning and I'm going to go and shoot some long exposure seascapes with the 50R. In terms of build and handling, it's quite a large camera compared to what we're used to holding from a Fujifilm camera, certainly a Fujifilm rangefinder camera. But the body itself is kind of like a very slim, very neat and flush, enthusiast-sized DSLR. It feels a little bit wider, maybe not quite as tall, but it's kind of 5D, 7D kind of size, D500, that kind of size bulk really, but without the big hand grips and the bulge on top for the viewfinder and the flash and all of that kind of stuff. When it comes to reviewing cameras, it's important that you get into the mind of the kind of photographer that's going to be using the camera and who it's designed for. This isn't for sports photographers, it's not for wildlife photographers, it's not a fast moving, fast paced, rugged kind of action camera. This is meant to be for landscape photographers, possibly street photographers as well. It's meant to be methodical. You're meant to produce brilliant kind of image quality from it with the huge 50 million pixel sensor. Now, when you take all that in mind, it's a camera that does actually slow down your photography, but in a good way. I have to say I took far fewer images while I was out shooting landscapes with it, and that's not necessarily because it's much slower to use, but there's kind of just something about it that makes you just want to slow down and consider your settings a little bit more. And then once you've got those settings, you can click away. That's not to say there aren't all the automated settings on here, but everything from just the larger screen, the larger dials, the larger body, the slower autofocus system. I've used manual focus quite a lot of the time during the end of my test, just because I wanted to slow down and just enjoy using the camera a little bit more. So the autofocus system, let's see if we can just hear that. It's loud, it's back and forth. It's not particularly fast. It just doesn't need to be. It isn't something that really bothered me. When I started to shoot a lot of the landscapes, I was using the continuous AF at first, particularly while I was using the camera handheld, but the second I got it on a tripod, I was manually focusing. You do have to be careful with the depth of field and really think about the way the depth of field changes when you're using medium format. Instinctively, I started shooting everything on kind of f8, f11, and I just wasn't quite getting the depth of field I wanted on some of the further objects in the scene. So I very quickly was having to change to kind of f16, f22 to make sure that I really maximize the depth of field. You kind of have to work one, maybe 1.5 apertures above what you'd used to be using, certainly 1 aperture above. So where I was shooting at f8, switched it up to f11, and that was more like what I was used to seeing shooting on a full frame sensor camera. So the Fujifilm GFX 50R, I have to say I think it's going to be another winner from Fuji with that sensor, that price, the growing lens lineup, and just the familiarity that Fujifilm users are going to have using this camera. In fact, anybody that's used to using a rangefinder camera or coming from a 35mm film camera or medium format film camera, this is going to just be very instinctive, and I think that's part of the great thing that Fujifilm does. I kind of wish the camera weighed a little bit more. The lenses are kind of a tiny bit out of balance, I think, with the camera, and that doesn't usually bother me, but you pick up the 50R and you kind of expect it to be a lot heavier than it is because of the weight that we're used to having on, you know, larger medium format cameras. Now that's also a very good thing because it means we've got a great lightweight camera to carry around, and I certainly didn't notice the weight of the camera and the three lenses going out, walking, hiking and using it all day. Didn't find it an issue for me, but obviously that's going to vary depending on you and your fitness and your health and what you personally are prepared to carry whilst you're out and about. So that's it. That's my little hands-on review of the GFX 50R. Great little camera, and I'm really looking forward to using it again in 2019. Might see if I can do a little landscape project with the camera and get it back in for a slightly longer period next time. If you want to see how that turns out, or if you want to keep up to date with all the latest photo gear news and reviews, make sure you hit that subscribe button.